There is a long-held tradition here at Seminary of the Southwest, and by that I mean it goes back at least to my junior year. Before that, I have no idea. That at some point during their time here, students will find a good pair of preaching boots. Now, I'm aware that there's a risk here of over-romanticizing a pair of shoes. And maybe an even bigger risk including those shoes in a sermon. But if the mention of preaching boots can't serve as a hook here, in this place, then it won't work anywhere. So we're going to give it a try. See, these boots, like any good pair of cleats or tap shoes, are worn with clear purpose in mind. And in my experience, when the preacher wears their preaching boots, regardless of the actual quality of the sermon, it's clear that they mean business. That they've taken seriously the task at hand. So, whatever your shoe choice of the day, I invite you to slip on a pair of metaphorical preaching boots. Because that's just what today's gospel means. Jesus has already ridden into Jerusalem, and thus he's begun the march that we know will ultimately take him to Golgotha. In today's gospel, we find him in the temple, confronted by the chief priests and the scribes, and in a response to a series of questioning and a general lack of acceptance of his authority, Jesus tells the parable that we just heard Sasha proclaim. An absentee landowner demands that his day-laboring tenants pay their rent. So he sends a slave to collect, only to find that the tenants have no intention of paying their share. They beat the slave and send him back to the landowner. And this landlord sends others, many others, we're told. The violence only escalates from assault to murder, including the beating and killing of the landowner's son and the quick disposal of his body. Scholarship and commentaries around this suggest that the parable is meant to be allegorical, thus painting God as the landowner, the prophets of old as the slaves, Jesus as the beloved son, the chief priests as the tenants, and Israel as the vineyard. However, parable, allegory, illustration, whatever we call it, this text is troubling. Living in the long shadow of slavery as we do in this country, what do we do with a text that so openly engages with that system? How do we read of oppressive and tyrannical structures that benefit the few when we're still working to unlearn and untangle ourselves from the very same structures today? How do we pass over a text with so much violence as the world watches with bated breath the invasion of Ukraine and the beginning of yet another war? How do we read? How do we engage a text like this? And what's more, there's no clear hero or villain here. The slaves are sent to their slaughter. The beloved son is killed. The tenants, who are the ones that do the killing, and thus the most likely candidates to be the bad guys, they're ruled by an absentee owner. So it's hard to see how they're getting a fair shake either. And the landlord, willing to send anyone but himself to collect the rent. The landlord is distant at best. This, to me, feels the most troubling. Because surely God doesn't treat God's chosen people like some sort of offshore account. Surely this can't be. Surely there's some good news. Because violence, hatred, and oppression of any kind leave their mark on all involved. The pain and the wounds are different, to be sure, but both the oppressed and the oppressor are stamped by the very systems that break us apart and break us away from our shared humanity. We know this to be true even as we try to uncover, unearth, and understand the mess that got us here. The mess that we now find ourselves in, and the mess that we hope we won't leave. Perhaps, just maybe then, the good news is found in that very mess. Quoting Psalm 118, Jesus ends this encounter that we read in the gospel by saying, "The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This was the Lord's doing, and it is amazing in our eyes." In other words, Jesus says, don't forget that in the messiness, God is still God. And God still does God. And God still acts God. And just so we're clear today about the God that we're talking about, this is the God who chose the baby floating down the river in a basket to be the man to lead God's people out of slavery. That God. This is the God who can save believers from a fiery furnace. That God. This is the God who chose an indigenous teenage girl from the hills to carry the gospel in her belly. That God. The God who calmed the seas, healed the sick, fed the crowds, and raised the dead. That God. The God who took an instrument of death in the cross and made it the way to life everlasting. That God. The good news is that this God, the God in the business of flipping the tables, that God has the power to enter even into the most oppressive of structures, the most dire of situations, the most shattered society, the most broken heart, the most lost soul, in order that the rejected stone might very well become the cornerstone. And if we're crazy enough to believe in that God, then maybe we are willing to take one more step on the road to partnership with God. And this is when we'll need those boots. See, because the powers and principalities are hard at work. A world ravaged by war. A country torn in two. A state trying to legislate identity. A city where housing costs and unhoused neighbors are forever on the rise. The vineyard, y'all, a place of life and fruit, is instead a place of death, sadness, and pain. And it is precisely in that messiness where God calls us to stand. As your preacher today, I want so desperately to wrap all of this up in a neat little box, put a bow on it, tie it up with a good line and some fancy alliteration, and tell you that it's all going to be okay. The truth is, the truth that you and I both know, is that this is not the mess into which God calls. On this side of the story, we know what comes after this encounter in the gospel. Jesus will continue his last days in Jerusalem, ultimately walking the road that will save the world. Tomorrow, we will begin again our own walk as we hear the words, "You are but dust, and to dust you shall return." May we be reminded today that as living members of God's dream in the world, in that messy in-between of the dust, we're called to put on our boots and kick up a little dust of our own. My friends, the God of hope, the God of love, urgently calls, calling you to be uniquely you, to live into your call as you partner with God on the long road to freedom. The world is hurting, crying, broken. Put your boots on. Hope lives and love wins. Put your boots on. God is God is God is God, as it was in the beginning, is now, and will be forever. So put your boots on. The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Take heart, dear friends. God is calling. Put your boots on. Amen.